Well, let's dive right into this, huh? We're tackling a book today that's stirred up, well, its fair share of opinions over the years, The Catcher in the Rye. And what gets me is, it's like decades later, people are still trying to figure out what Holden Caulfield is all about.
It's really something else. You're right. This book just seems to hit a nerve,
Mm.
Like it's saying something about being young and
Hmm.
realizing the world. Maybe it ain't all it's cracked up to be. And that feeling, it kind of sticks with you.
Totally. And you've been spending some quality time with Holden again, right? Going back through those excerpts, the plot, the critics, even the whole censorship thing. Anything jump out at you this time around?
You know what's funny? It's like those three things, they're all tangled up together. The stuff that got Catcher in the Rye and Hot Water, Holden's voice, the way he's so fed up with everything, how he questions everything. That's also what makes people want to read it in the first place.
No doubt. That voice of his, you gotta hand it to Salinger. He nailed that teenage angst. And that word, phony. Why do you think that still hits home, even if you didn't grow up in the 50s?
I think deep down, whether you're 16 or 60, we've all had those moments where you can tell something's off. Like, what are we even doing here? Holden just says it out loud, no filter. And it's kind of funny, but also kind of breaks your heart a little.
Which brings up the whole debate, right? Is he just a whiny kid, or is there something deeper going on with Holden?
Exactly. You got some critics, they see him as this kid who's stuck, can't deal with how messy being an adult is. But then there's others, they say that phony thing he's got that's like a superpower almost. He sees through the BS and he wants something real, which is kind of refreshing.
And then there's that image everyone's got in their head. Holden, the catcher in the rye, saving all these kids from falling off a cliff. But you pointed out he's got the poem wrong. Adds a whole other layer, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, that's S-hole Holden, messing up the details. But here's the thing, that messed up poem, it says so much about him. He's clinging to this idea of childhood like it's this perfect thing. Because growing up, terrifying, becoming phony himself, even worse.
It's like he's fighting a losing battle, but you can't help but feel for the guy, you know? That vulnerability, wanting something real. A lot of us have been there, even if we don't want to be stuck in Holden's shoes.
Totally. And hey, speaking of things that are loaded with meaning, that hunting hat of his, talk about a symbol, right? It's like this big sign of, this is me for most of the book. But then, by the end, who's wearing it? Phoebe.
Oh, wow, good point. Like she's the catcher now, in a way.
Right, and that relationship between them. So interesting. Phoebe, she's got this wisdom, even though she's younger. She sees his pain, but she's also like, hey, dude, the world's not all bad.
It's crazy how Salinger takes what could have been just another coming-of-age story and makes it so multi-layered. But you mentioned Catcher in the Rye could be seen as a war novel in disguise. Now that seems like a bit of a stretch, no?
At first, yeah, maybe. But think about Salinger's own life, what he went through in World War II, seeing that stuff firsthand, the horrors, the loss. It does something to you. Catcher might not be about war, like literally, but that feeling of trauma, being disillusioned, trying to make sense of a world gone nuts, it's all there.
And that probably explains why this book gets such strong reactions. Even now, we've got everyone chiming in, presidents, critics, you name it. Some love it, some hate it.
It's true. The Catcher in the Rye is like that friend you either adore or can't stand, no in between. But that strong reaction, good or bad, tells you something, right? It makes you think, maybe uncomfortably, and that's kind of the point of art, isn't it?
And strong reactions, well, that brings us to the whole censorship thing, right? Like you can't talk about Catcher in the Rye without talking about that. Kind of ironic when you think about it. A book that's all about calling out phonies, and then it becomes this target for the people who, well, seem pretty darn phony to me. What's your take on that?
It's like that saying, right? Life imitates art. This book, it gets under people's skin, makes them squirm a bit, and not always in a bad way. It pushes buttons, says things some folks don't want to hear, uses language that some people think, oh, you can't say that. Plus, it dives headfirst into topics people like to avoid: sex, feeling alone, that kind of stuff.
And it wasn't just the language, right? Didn't some people trying to say it was like part of some communist plot or something? Sounds kind of crazy now.
Yeah, looking back, it does seem kind of wild, but that was a different time, The Cold War, everyone looking over their shoulder, and anything that seemed even remotely rebellious, well, people got suspicious.
Which is funny because a lot of what Holden's railing against, fitting in, buying a bunch of stuff, blindly doing what you're told, that feels pretty relevant even now, don't you think?
100%. That's what makes this book, 70 years old now? And it still hits home. That human need to be real, to connect with something real, it never gets old.
Makes you wonder, though, with all the controversy and everything, could Catcher ever be a movie? especially with how Salinger felt about Hollywood.
Right. I mean, that whole My Foolish Heart thing, turning his short story into a movie, yeah, that really messed him up. He felt like they butchered it, and he swore, no way, Hollywood's never touching Catcher.
And he meant it too. Think about it. Spielberg, Weinstein, those are big names to say no to.
Exactly. That's how much this book meant to him, how much he wanted to protect it. Although, here's the kicker. After he died, a letter popped up, and it sounded like maybe, just maybe, he might have considered a movie adaptation after he was gone.
Get out! Really? So there's a chance someday we might see Holden Caulfield on the big screen. Although, gotta share this, you hear about that time Disney almost made an animated Catcher in the Rye with German Shepherds.
Wait, seriously? That's hilarious.
No, for real. It's like something Holden would rant about, right? The ultimate phony Hollywood move.
Totally. But speaking of ironic, you remember that sequel someone wrote while he was still alive?
Oh, yeah. 60 years later. Coming Through the Rye. That was a whole thing, wasn't it? Makes you think, where do you draw the line with fan fiction and all that?
Good question. There's a ton of fan fiction out there, right? But it's usually just for fun. No one's making money off it. But when that sequel, when they published it, that's different. And Salinger, private as he wasn't having it. Sued him, which you got to kind of respect it.
Yeah, like Holden Caulfield, he wasn't just a character anymore, he was Salinger's, and nobody messes with this kid, right? But seriously, what do you think it is about this book, even after all these years? Why do you think it still connects with people, generation after generation?
Man, that's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, critics have been going back and forth about it forever. But part of it, it's got to be how Salinger nailed that teenage voice. The way Holden thinks, what he's worried about, what makes him mad. It's real. Like you read it and you just know, yeah, that's what it feels like. Even if you're miles away from your teenage years.
It's true, you know? Like they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Teenagers now, they might not talk like Holden, but that feeling of not fitting in, trying to figure out who you are, where you belong, that never goes out of style.
Exactly. And Catcher in the Rye, it lays it all out there. No holds barred. Plus, let's be real, Salinger went there. He talked about sex, death, mental health stuff. Back then.
Yeah.
That was pretty bold, especially for a book about a teenager.
It's like he gave a voice to a whole group of people who felt like no one was listening. You know? And that's powerful, to read something and be like, whoa, someone else gets it, even if that someone is a character in a book. But it's not just teenagers, right? I mean, plenty of adults, they love Catcher.
You're right. You know how many people reread Catcher later in life and find a whole new meaning in it? Maybe they see a bit of themselves in Holden, that cynicism, that wanting something more. Or maybe just brings them back to that time when they were young and thought they could change the world before life, happened.
And that ending. Holden watching Phoebe on the carousel. Man, that just gets me every time.
Beautiful, isn't it? Not your typical happy ending, but there's hope there, It's like Holden, in that moment, he finally chills out a little. He realizes he can't shield Phoebe or himself from the world and all its messiness, but he can still see the beauty in it, even if it's from afar. That's a powerful message, no matter how old you are.
No doubt. We've talked about what Catcher in the Rye is, but what about what it's not? It's been misunderstood, demonized even.
That's what happens when something becomes a big deal. People start projecting their own stuff onto it, their fears, their agendas.
Yeah.
Like those folks who wanted to ban Catcher thought it was dangerous, corrupting the youth.
They totally missed the point, didn't they? Got so hung up on the little things they couldn't see what he was really getting at, that search for something real, something true.
100%. Now, Holden, he's not perfect, right? He can be a real downer sometimes. But underneath it all, he's searching. He wants something genuine in a world full of, crap. And who hasn't felt that way at some point?
It's true. That's one of those things that never gets old.
Yeah.
Wanting something real, something to believe in. It's like 70 years later, and that's still what hooks people when they read Catcher.
Says a lot about good books, don't it?
Yeah.
They stick with you, make you think, even after you've put them down. And not always in a comfortable way.
Right. You nailed it. The Catcher in the Rye, it's not just a book. It's like an experience. But as we wrap this up, something's been kind of bugging me. We've talked about how Holden, he's all about wanting something real, but do you think that changes as we get older?
And that's a good question. Does it fade away? That need, that ache for something genuine? Or does it just morph into something else?
Yeah, maybe growing up is kind of about finding new ways to hold on to that realness, even when life gets messy and you got to compromise.
Maybe so. Or maybe, just maybe, Catcher in the Rye reminds us that there's a part of us, the part that hates phonies and wants something real, That part never really grows old at all.
And maybe that's okay, right? That little bit of, I don't know, idealism, that refusal to just accept things the way they are, maybe we need that.
Definitely something to think about.
It is. And on that note, we'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into The Catcher in the Rye. Until next time, happy reading.